Okay, EOS should not allow you to vote for 30 block producer candidates with the full weight of your staked tokens. Staked EOS itself, because of the ease with which you can reclaim that value, is in fact a mediocre proxy for measuring how much value is actually at stake. And furthermore, any way you choose to objectively measure stake will optimize for selecting specific types of participants in an ecosystem who just happen to be best positioned for that measurement strategy. A very deep dive into all that and more is coming up in this fairly long rant. This is James Mart. I want to talk again about economics and incentive structures and voting and staking and all that good stuff. I want to give a quick disclaimer first that none of what I say is a reflection of my employer, Fractally. I am contributing this simply as a member of the EOS community, as I've done plenty of times in the past before I was working at Fractally. Also, I think I did an okay job in a previous rant at describing some of the fundamental principles of blockchain consensus design, but it was in the context of also talking about some very specific circumstances that are no longer relevant to what I want to talk about now. So sorry if some of you have heard it before, but the next few minutes of this rant are actually going to be just a cut and paste of the audio from the previous rant that I mentioned. Then I'll add lots more details afterwards. So, all right, without further ado, here we go. The goal of a blockchain consensus mechanism is to align those with the power to produce blocks and those with value at stake for the adoption and the success of the blockchain. This isn't unique to EOS or delegated proof of stake. It's true in proof of work, proof of stake, really most consensus mechanisms. In Bitcoin, ASIC mining hardware, application-specific integrated circuit hardware, is essentially a sunk cost for miners. It can't really be used for anything but Bitcoin mining. Therefore, the cost of that hardware, and also the cost of every kilowatt hour spent mining, is part of their stake in the success of Bitcoin. Clearly then, in Bitcoin, miners have stake. Bitcoin block producers are often assumed to be miners, but that is often not the case. Block producers are often pool operators who built systems to allow individual miners to coordinate and share block rewards. Proof of work is a consensus algorithm that simply uses the mechanism of work, or hashing, as a way to measure the stake of participants over time. Crucially, this concept of mining pools demonstrates that the stake, or the hash power, is separate from those with, for lack of a better term, political power, the block producers. Rather, stake is delegated to the entities who set up the mining pools, who then broadcast the completed proofs of work and who produce the actual blocks. It would be the pool operators, for example, the block producers, not all the miners in Bitcoin who would need to coordinate if they wanted to censor a transaction or something. Proof of work, therefore, can be thought of as very similar to delegated proof of stake. But if a Bitcoin stakeholder, or miner, wants to delegate their stake to multiple mining pools, their hash power is divided between the pools. To perfectly represent that relationship in a delegated proof of stake environment, it would be necessary to use one token, one divisible vote, which is a coin voting strategy wherein any additional block producers to which a user delegates their stake will divide the total stake between the delegates. Just like mining for multiple mining pools means each pool is only going to get some fraction of your hardware's total mining capacity. But EOS doesn't use one token, one divisible vote. It uses one token, 30 votes, effectively multiplying your stake whenever you vote for an additional block producer. It's as if in Bitcoin, my mining hardware could work at max capacity in parallel for up to 30 different mining pools at the same time, which obviously doesn't make any sense. Now, this trade-off in EOS is made for a good reason. It has to do with preventing Byzantine faults on the network, which I won't get into here, but for that reason, it makes the analysis to determine whether block producers really represent the consensus of those with the most at stake very difficult. All right. That was the end of the audio I took from a different rant. And so, contrary to what you just heard me say, I am going to go deeper right now into why 1 token 30 votes was actually an important trade-off in EOS for Byzantine fault tolerance. Byzantine faults, for the uninitiated, are essentially the largest possible set of faults that can happen in a distributed system. Outside of blockchains, I know SpaceX, for example, considered attempting to construct the network of sensors and components in their rockets to be Byzantine fault tolerant. So it's not just some blockchain-specific concept. And rockets may be one of the few examples of systems that we would actually want to spend the effort to make tolerant of Byzantine faults. In the context of blockchain networks, consider that a node on the network could be malicious and attempt to spread fake data to other nodes. Or there could be a bug in the software causing a node to incorrectly update its state. Or, for that matter, a cosmic ray from the sun could happen to strike a transistor in a machine in such a way as to flip a bit from a 0 to a 1, corrupting the data. And there's a million other edge cases. Blockchains need to be resilient even to these types of errors, these Byzantine faults. And one such subclass of Byzantine faults are those that would prevent a network from arriving at a shared state or a shared view of the whole system. Or in the context of blockchain, a failure to reach consensus. As it turns out, all blockchains, or at least the vast majority of blockchains that are using some flavor of pBFT consensus, are only as secure as the amount of stake that backs the bottom third of the validator set. Let me say that again. Essentially, any blockchain is only as secure as the amount of stake backing the bottom third of the validator set. So in EOS, that validator set is the block producers from positions 15 to 21, right? In Bitcoin, it's the amount of hash power it would take to produce roughly a third of the blocks, which, spoiler alert, is no more than the top few entities by hash power, not including mining pools. The reason that the number to care about is the bottom third of stake is a mathematical result that came from a paper out of MIT by Miguel Castro and Barbara Liskov on how to implement practical Byzantine fault tolerance in distributed systems. That's why you constantly hear about needing 2/3 + 1 agreement when reaching consensus. 1/3 or more colluding nodes in the validator set would be able to halt the ability for the network to reach consensus. So how is all this related to 1 token 30 votes? Actually, to understand, you need one more piece of background information that has to do with the inevitable Pareto distribution of stake. As I've mentioned already, much of blockchain engineering has to do with how we choose to measure stake. How do we determine the relative stake among participants? Bitcoin answers that question in terms of hash power. It's actually a reasonable proxy for the value irrevocably spent, and therefore at risk should the whole Bitcoin project fail. Proof of stake blockchains answer the question in terms of staked tokens, because there is some amount of value irrevocably lost by the opportunity cost of holding your tokens in an asset that you can't use for other purposes. But essentially, no matter how you answer this question of how to measure stake, the actual distribution of stake among participants will follow a Pareto distribution curve, where 10 or 20% of the participants will account for 80 or 90% of the stake. Now, this isn't a mathematical law or something. It is a second order principle. It's an observation that one can make time and time again. The reason why stake follows a Pareto distribution seems to be that for any metric you decide to consider relevant, you are inherently selecting, often unintentionally, for some subset of people who are just very well positioned to maximize their ranking in that measurement. In proof of work, for example, it's those mining companies who happen to have their roots in regions of the world with the cheapest available electricity, or who have special business relationships with TSMC or some other semiconductor fab that can produce the ASICs used in Bitcoin mining. In proof of stake, it's the central hubs through which tokens happen to flow as liquidity passes around the network, or in other words, the exchanges. Surprise, surprise. So, okay, finally, let's talk about 1 token, 30 votes. If you could rank order the entities in an ecosystem from most stake to least stake, which is very non-trivial since we don't know which on-chain accounts might be shared by the same owner, but if you could rank order the entities in an ecosystem from most stake to least stake, you could see that the amount of stake falls off exponentially, such that the majority of the stake would end up being controlled by just the top 3 or 4 or maybe 5 entities. So now combine that with the fact that the bottom third of the validator set would be able to collude to produce a consensus halt, and you realize that simply allocating 1 vote per token could leave the network very vulnerable to a hostile takeover of the bottom third of the validators, which would require a relatively small amount of stake to accomplish. Thus, the idea for 1 token, 30 votes is born, where you effectively allow the top few entities with that controlling amount of stake to dictate who the top 30 entities are in the network, because you effectively give them 30 times their vote weight. So now, even for a moderately well-capitalized attacker, you would need to exceed the amount of stake behind these superpower entities with the vast majority of the stake in the whole ecosystem in order to carry out the aforementioned attack. So it's highly unlikely. That is the reason for 1 token, 30 votes. And now you can start putting more of the puzzle pieces together for why EOS was designed as it is, with a focus on public, non-anonymous block producers, because if the community truly adopts the ethic of well-known block producers, such as companies or universities or countries, then now we can have our cake and eat it too. We can let the top few entities who control the majority of stake essentially choose who becomes a validator, and we use off-chain knowledge to establish our confidence that the chain is sufficiently decentralized. Because, after all, we know the entities running the top nodes. If the block producers in paid slots became anonymous, then it could be because the top controlling entities all spun up anonymous, quote, sock puppet, unquote, block producer entities and elected them into paid positions. In this case, a community that cares about decentralization could fork off from the controllers, who would then effectively lose their wealth for their misdeeds. But all of this depends on a highly coordinated and frankly highly educated token holder base, which to me, in retrospect, is something we obviously can't and shouldn't rely on. Which finally brings me to the point that if I could choose, I'd have you take away from this rant. EOS should not be using 1 token, 30 votes. 1 token, 30 votes gives the illusion of decentralization because it looks like many different entities are independently elected, but it does not and cannot do anything about the Pareto distribution of stake, which inevitably means that the stake in the chain will be controlled by a precious few entities. This is why it has often seemed to the EOS token holder that they are powerless to effect change. It's because you are. 1 token 30 votes effectively mitigates the Byzantine fault it was designed to prevent, but at the cost of a mostly static validator set who benefits from the status quo and need not do more than produce blocks to remain in power. The only weapons token holders truly have against this is to either sell their EOS in search of a chain that makes some preferred trade-off, or fork the incumbents out. Okay, but wait, there is actually a third option. These controlling stakeholders are not in the position they're in for no reason. They do actually have a lot of stake, which means they are in fact incentivized to act in the best interest of the blockchain. Now maybe they aren't as motivated as someone who has the fear of losing their job. So perhaps we could say they're motivated exclusively by a carrot and not a stick. But if we, the free market, the community, can come up with proposals that can realistically increase the value proposition of EOS in the eyes of the greater cryptoverse, then it is possible for the hope of capital gains, the carrot, to move the horse in a beneficial direction. So if we were to follow my preferred proposal on migrating 1 token 30 votes to a 1 token 1 divisible vote strategy for electing block producers, which, if you don't know what 1 token 1 divisible vote is, it is, it's something I'm not going to go into here. Maybe I'll talk more about it later. But if we were to use that, we would need to contend again with the original problem of how to deal with a weak bottom third of the validator set. How can we solve it? Well, okay, start with first principles. We know that stake, no matter how we choose to measure it, will be Pareto distributed. So one simple solution would just be to reduce our validator set to, say, 6 block producers, or 7. Now, obviously, this sounds scandalously low, but it is acknowledging the reality of a Pareto distribution and solving the issue of a weak bottom third validator set, right? Because the bottom third would still represent an extremely high amount of stake, since it's the block producers in positions 5 or 6, 5 and 6, as opposed to 15 to 21, which is an enormous difference if you recall that stake falls off exponentially. But I do predict that this would be a very difficult political move or business move for EOS. It would seem to confirm in the minds of our detractors their worst fears about the centralization of EOS. I mean, it could even appear to be a hostile takeover of the network, forever cementing the top 5 or 6 players into their elected positions. So we are left with, to my knowledge, only one other option, or class of options. We could add non-overlapping Pareto distributions. So what I mean is, we could change EOS to acknowledge stake not only as a function of locked tokens, but also as a function of, for example, proof of burn. Which entities in our ecosystem would be most well positioned to burn tokens? It likely wouldn't be exchanges, whose EOS reserves with which they vote are often held for the purpose of satisfying their customers' future withdrawals. It would likely be some other type of entity in the ecosystem who could capitalize on such a mechanism, and by so doing, introduce a different 3 to 5 superpowers under that Pareto distribution into the ecosystem with which to counterbalance the token lock superpowers. Right? Or imagine if we actually used proof of work, just like Bitcoin, to elect a few validators. Basically, if we could find a way to use 4 or 5 non-overlapping Pareto distributions to elect validators, then we could legitimately arrive at a place where we have 21 unique block-producing entities who have roughly equivalent amounts of stake, and thus we achieve decentralization and avoid the bottom third Byzantine failure mode. This concept, by the way, of using multiple Pareto distributions to improve decentralization is not new. It's not my idea. I don't think it's originally Dan Larimer's idea, but I do absolutely recommend that anyone interested in learning more about this go read Dan's 2019 Medium article called Decentralizing in Spite of Pareto, which I'll leave a link to in the description. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that the proposal by the Fractally team to use the fractal democracy election mechanic to elect half of the EOS validators is another manifestation of this same push to find non-overlapping distributions of entities to control the validator set. The beauty of this type of solution is that it changes the goal of blockchain engineers from trying to find the consensus mechanism that most perfectly mirrors the stake held by participants to simply looking to maximize decentralization by finding objectively measurable, non-overlapping distributions of participants to elect. It almost doesn't matter what the metrics are, as long as they're non-overlapping. Like, if a blockchain could objectively measure things like IQ or top speed in a race or body mass index or average number of three-point basketball shots made in under a minute, then we could use all these distributions to elect validators. It's counterintuitive, but it would functionally result in a random cross-section of the population of participants in such a way as to be ungameable. It changes the economics of only looking for those entities with the most at stake. But it preserves the features that we want to preserve, like uncapturability and openness and neutrality and decentralization. All right, that's all for this one. Hope you enjoyed, and thanks for listening.